This is the story of Martin Nowroy and his wife Diane Nowroy. They had been married for 19 years when the accident happened, not the car accident that broke Martin's left leg in 2 places, but the quieter one that had been happening for years inside their house, inside their silences, inside the way Diane had learned to look through him rather than at him. Martin was not a difficult man to love, but he had made himself easy to overlook. Methodical, provided, uncomfortable with need. Diane had once found this quality restful. Later, she found it convenient. The marriage had not failed so much as it had been slowly, carefully disassembled, one small decision at a time, one redirected conversation, one unexplained evening, until what remained looked like a life together but functioned like 2 people sharing a building. What no one knew, not even Martin, was that while he had been quietly retreating into his work and his silences, someone had been quietly retreating into his savings. The morning routine had not changed in 11 years. Martin woke at 6:15, made coffee in the French press Diane had bought on a trip to Portland they took before her mother's illness, before his promotion, before the time when trips together became logistically complicated and then simply stopped being planned. He poured 2 cups out of habit, though Diane had moved herself to the guest bedroom 8 months ago, citing his restlessness, his tendency to check his phone at 2 in the morning, the way he sometimes read with the lamp on. He left her cup on the counter anyway. Some mornings it was gone when he returned from his shower. Most mornings it sat there until it went cold and he poured it down the drain without comment. He was 47 and worked as a structural consultant for a mid-sized firm in Columbus. His days were filled with load calculations and site visits and conference calls about things that required precision, tolerances measured in millimeters, margins that did not forgive carelessness. He was good at his job in the way that people who find comfort in rules are often good at things that require them. His colleagues respected him. His clients trusted him. He was not, by any observable measure, a man in crisis. Diane managed the household finances. This had been her suggestion 12 years ago, when Martin's father died and left him a portfolio that neither of them knew how to navigate. Diane had always been better with money, organized, attentive to detail, comfortable with spreadsheets in a way Martin was not. He had been grateful. He had remained grateful, in the passive way that people remain grateful for arrangements that continue to function without demanding attention. They had a joint account, a shared investment portfolio, and a home with 11 years left on the mortgage. Martin knew the rough shape of their financial life the way he knew the layout of a building he consulted on years ago. He understood its structure, but he didn't live in it. Their evenings were quiet. Diane worked from home as a medical billing consultant, and she was usually at her desk until 8 or 9, sometimes later. Martin cooked or ordered in. They watched things on separate screens. They said goodnight with a proximity that resembled affection. It was in October that he met Renata Voss. She was introduced to him through a colleague whose mother she had cared for the previous year, a woman of 65 who had suffered a stroke and needed assistance during her recovery. The colleague, a man named Phil Garrett, spoke of Renata in the distracted but certain way people speak of professionals they trust: competent, steady. Not the kind to make things uncomfortable. Martin hadn't known he would need a caregiver until 3 days before he called her. The accident was unremarkable in the way that accidents are when they happen to careful people. A wet curb outside a parking garage, a misstep, a fall that took less than 2 seconds and rearranged the next 4 months of his life. The orthopedic surgeon was matter-of-fact about the fractures, non-surgical, a cast to the knee, weight-bearing restrictions for 6 weeks, then partial for another 4. He would need help at home. Diane had listened to this information in the hospital room with an expression Martin could not read. Not cold. He would not have called it cold, but contained, as though she were processing a logistical problem rather than a medical one. She had meetings, she said. She had clients she couldn't reschedule. She had her own work to manage. She said all of this gently, apologetically, the way someone declines a social invitation they feel mildly guilty about missing. "I'll find someone," Martin had said. "Are you sure?" she'd asked, and he understood from her tone that she hoped he was. Renata arrived on a Tuesday morning with a cloth bag containing a thermos, a paperback novel, and a small notebook in which she kept, Martin would later learn, a schedule of every patient she'd worked with and what they needed most. She was 52, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of stillness that does not come from passivity, but from long practice. She looked around his kitchen and his living room and asked one question before she asked anything practical. "Is there someone else here who I should coordinate with?" Martin had looked toward the closed door of Diane's office at the end of the hall, from which the low sound of a phone call could be heard. "Not really," he said. Renata had nodded once and written something in her notebook and said nothing further about it. That first week passed in the dull, humbling rhythm of dependency. Martin was not a man who accepted help gracefully. This was among the first things Renata understood about him. He would attempt things before asking. He would refuse assistance twice before accepting it once. He apologized for requests that were entirely reasonable and did not apologize for moods that were not. She managed all of this without comment, without performance, without the cheerful professional distance that Martin had feared, and that would have made him feel like a problem to be managed. On the sixth evening, Diane came briefly into the living room while Renata was helping Martin adjust his leg elevation. She said hello pleasantly. She asked Renata if she needed anything. She brought a glass of water that no one had requested and set it on the side table and then returned to her office. The door clicked shut. Renata had said nothing, but Martin had watched her, the brief pause before she resumed adjusting the pillow, the way her eyes had tracked Diane's retreating figure with something that was not curiosity exactly, something more considered than that. He told himself it was nothing. It was not nothing. By the third week, Martin had stopped apologizing for needing things. This was a small change and a significant one. Renata had not pushed for it. She had simply continued to be present without making presence feel like a transaction, and gradually something in Martin's posture shifted. Not toward her, exactly, but toward the possibility that being cared for was not the same thing as being weak. He had spent so many years constructing his self-sufficiency as a kind of virtue that he had not noticed how much of his interior life had been quarantined behind it. They talked during her hours in a way Martin did not talk with most people. Not intimately at first, but truthfully. He asked her about her work. She answered without embellishment. He mentioned his job. She asked questions that were better than the questions most people asked. Diane moved through the house at the edges of these conversations, visible in the periphery, largely absent in any meaningful sense. One afternoon near the end of her shift, Renata was sitting in the chair across from Martin's couch while he reviewed documents on his laptop. He had been managing emails with increasing competence, adapting to the cast with the same methodical patience he applied to everything. Renata was reading her novel. The quiet between them was the comfortable kind. "Do you look at your financials often?" she asked. She did not look up from the book. Martin glanced over. "Why?" "Just curious." Some people find it grounding. When they're stuck somewhere and feeling out of control, they check the things they can track. He considered this. "Not lately. Diane manages most of it." Renata turned a page. "That's a lot of trust." "She's good at it," Martin said. And then, because something in the sentence felt incomplete, "she's always been good at it." Renata said nothing further. She finished the chapter and packed her bag at 5 o'clock and said she'd see him Thursday. Martin went to bed that night and found himself, for the first time in perhaps 2 years, thinking about the finances. Not with alarm, just thinking about them. The way you press a tooth with your tongue to check if it hurts. He logged into the investment account the next morning. He had to reset his password. What he found did not immediately alarm him. The balances were lower than he remembered them being, but he was not precise about what he remembered. There had been market corrections, there had been expenses. He and Diane had discussed briefly the possibility of refinancing the house. He couldn't recall what had been decided. He closed the tab and did not return to it for several days. Meanwhile, the marriage continued its performance. Diane checked on him in the evenings with what seemed, on its surface, like solicitude. She brought him things. She asked how the leg felt. She stayed for minutes rather than seconds, sometimes perching on the arm of the couch with her phone in her hand, having what looked like a conversation but contained on her side very little actual attention. Martin answered her questions. She received his answers and moved on. He had stopped noticing this years ago. Renata's presence had made him notice it again. One evening, Diane said, "She seems good." The caregiver, "She is good," Martin said. "You seem more comfortable lately." She said it as though it were a mildly puzzling observation about the weather. "I'm getting used to the setup." Diane nodded and looked at her phone briefly and then back at him. "She doesn't seem like she'd be much fun." "I don't need fun," Martin said. "I need someone reliable." Something passed across Diane's face, too quick to name, and she stood and said she had a call to finish. Martin watched her leave and understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that what she had offered had been something like concern but had functioned as surveillance. She had not been checking on his well-being, she had been checking on something else. He pressed the tooth again that night. It hurt a little now. He logged back in. He spent an hour this time, going back through 12 months of transactions. He found 3 wire transfers he did not recognize. Modest amounts, 8,000, 11,000, 6,000, spaced far enough apart that they would not have been alarming in isolation. Together, they felt like a pattern. He photographed the screen with his phone and closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time without reaching any conclusion except that he needed to understand what he was looking at before he said anything to anyone. He called Renata the following morning before her shift, which he had never done before. "I have a question," he said. "You asked me about the financials the other day. Was that casual?" A pause, long enough to be intentional. "No," she said. "It wasn't." She told him on a Thursday afternoon, sitting in the kitchen, the coffee between them getting cold. She had worked for Diane. Not currently. 3 years ago, briefly, during a period when Diane had been building her medical billing consultancy and had needed someone to manage scheduling and client coordination. Renata had done contract work for 6 small practices and independent consultants. It was not unusual. She had stayed 8 months before leaving. Not dramatically, but with a growing discomfort she had filed away as professional instinct. She had seen things she hadn't fully understood at the time. Billing adjustments that didn't match the paperwork, she said. Transfers into accounts I wasn't given access to. She kept certain files separate from everything else, password protected, not shared with the other contractors. I thought maybe it was a compliance issue. I didn't know whose money it was. She looked at Martin steadily. "When Phil mentioned you and your name, Elroy, I recognized it. I didn't say anything immediately because I wasn't certain. But after the first week here, I was certain." Martin sat with this for a long time. The cast was on the coffee table. The house was quiet. "Why didn't you just tell me?" "Because you weren't ready," she said. "And because I wanted to be sure before I gave you information that was going to change your life." He did not challenge this. It was accurate. "What are you proposing?" he asked. "Not revenge," she said, as though she'd anticipated the word. "I'm proposing clarity. I have partial records from when I worked for her, enough to know where to look. If you give me authorization to access certain accounts with you, and if we contact the right forensic accountant, we can build a picture of what's been happening and for how long. After that, you decide what to do with it." "Why?" Martin asked. "What do you get from this?" Renata picked up her coffee and looked at it without drinking. "Because I should have said something 3 years ago, and I didn't, and that bothers me." Martin looked at his hands. He thought about the 8,000, the 11,000, the 6,000. He thought about 12 years of gratitude, of delegated trust, of cups of coffee gone cold on a kitchen counter. "All right," he said. He did not confront Diane that evening. He had learned in 30 years of structural work that the most dangerous moment in any load-bearing assessment was the moment before you understood fully what you were dealing with. You did not push until you knew what would hold and what would fall. He watched her across the dinner table, take out again, which she ate standing at the counter while looking at her phone. And he understood something he had not let himself understand before, that her management of their money had always felt like a gift, but had also always been a form of leverage. She had organized their financial life in a way that required her He had allowed it because he had trusted her, and also because it had suited him, because delegation had freed him to be elsewhere, in his work, in his head, in the private country of his introversion. He had made himself convenient to deceive. This was not a comfortable realization, and he did not try to make it comfortable. Diane said without looking up. "Did Renata stay late today?" "A little." "You two talk a lot." "She's easy to talk to." Diane set her fork down. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in what felt like months. "Martin." Yes. She seemed about to say something. The moment stretched. Then she picked up her phone and said, "Nothing. Never mind." He nodded. He ate. The silence between them was familiar but no longer comfortable. Something had shifted in its texture, from the silence of mutual indifference to the silence of two people who were both waiting, for different reasons, to see what happens next. 3 months later, the cast was gone. The limp was mostly gone. Renata was no longer a daily presence. Though she came twice a week under the pretext of physical support exercises, a fiction that both of them maintained for reasons that had become practical rather than personal, the forensic accountant was a man named Gerald Cho, 60 years old, referred by Martin's attorney. He was the kind of man who communicated exclusively in documents, and who seemed genuinely content to spend weeks inside spreadsheets and account histories. He did not speculate. He did not offer opinions. He produced, after 6 weeks, a report that ran to 41 pages with exhibits. The figure was not catastrophic. It was not a number that would ruin Martin. But it was a number that represented 9 years, and it was a number that had been moved in small, careful increments into an account that Diane held alone. Not jointly, alone. At a bank Martin had never heard of, under an LLC registered in Delaware that bore no relationship to her consultancy. Martin read the report at his kitchen table on a Sunday morning with a cup of coffee and no particular expression on his face. He had expected to feel something with more heat. He had expected anger, or the vertiginous grief of absolute betrayal. What he felt instead was something slower and more leaden, a long, dull recognition, as though some part of him had known the shape of this for years and had chosen not to trace it. Diane had begun, in the months since October, to run a kind of quiet campaign. She had started cooking again. Real cooking, the kind she'd done in the first years of their marriage. She had made small overtures of conversation that were more sustained, more genuine seeming than what had become normal. She had moved back into the bedroom, framing it tentatively as a gesture toward reconnection. "I've been distant," she said, one evening in early January, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I know I have. I think I'd gotten lost in my work." Martin had listened. He had not said, "I know what you've been doing." He had said, "We both have," which was true enough. He watched her with a strange dual vision during those weeks, seeing both the woman he had married, who was still present in occasional, real ways, and the woman who had been moving money into a private account for nearly a decade with the patience and concealment of someone who had long ago made a decision about the relationship's future. He wondered when she had made it. He wondered if she knew herself. Renata, during one of their Tuesday mornings, said, "You're stalling. I'm preparing." There's a difference, yes. She didn't pursue it, but she was right. He was prepared. He had the report. He had the documentation. He had spoken with his attorney. He had done everything required. He was stalling because doing the thing, actually doing it, required accepting that the 19 years were over. Not because they had failed organically, but because one person had been, for a very long time, oriented toward an exit, and had been provisioning for it quietly and had simply not yet taken the step. He was stalling because he needed, for reasons he couldn't entirely justify, to understand why. In February, he asked her, not about the money. Not yet. He asked her on a Wednesday evening after dinner that she had cooked and that was very good. "When did you stop thinking of this as something worth working on?" Diane looked at him across the table. A long moment. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." She set down her glass. She looked away, at the window, which showed only the dark of the yard. "I think," she said slowly, "I think I was so tired for so long of asking for things that you couldn't give. Not because you didn't care. I know you cared, but caring and being present aren't the same thing, and I exhausted myself trying to close that distance." She paused. "I know that doesn't. I'm not asking so that I can argue," Martin said. "I'm asking because I want to understand." She looked at him then with an expression he hadn't seen in years, unguarded, briefly, before it closed again. "I don't know if there's a version of this that makes sense to either of us," she said. "Maybe not," Martin said. They sat in silence for a while. It was not a comfortable silence, and it was not an aggressive one. It was the silence of two people who had come, by different routes, to the same unremarkable conclusion, and who were not yet sure what to do with the trip. They met in Gerald Cho's office on a Thursday in March. Martin's attorney was there. Diane had brought her own, a woman named Sandra Park who had clearly reviewed the report and who sat with the professional composure of someone absorbing difficult information on behalf of a client. Diane herself sat with her hands folded on the table, her expression difficult to read but not closed. She looked, Martin thought, like someone who had been waiting for a door to open, and now that it had, found the hallway less certain than expected. The conversation was civil. It was largely conducted by the attorneys. The settlement they were moving toward was not punitive, not because Martin was incapable of pursuing more, but because the equation, when he examined it honestly, included his own years of absence, his retreat into work and silence, his failure to notice what had been happening in front of him. He was not guilt-free. No one in this room was guilt-free. Diane spoke once, directly to him, while the attorneys were reviewing a clause. "I'm sorry about the money," she said. Her voice was even. "I know you understand the rest, even if you won't say so." Martin looked at her for a moment. "I do understand it," he said. "That doesn't change what it was." She nodded. "No, it doesn't." That was all. Sandra Park turned back to the document, and the moment passed and did not return. Renata was waiting in the lobby when Martin came down. She had not been asked to come. She had simply appeared, sitting in one of the stiff lobby chairs with her thermos and her paperback, as though she were waiting for a long appointment to conclude. He sat down beside her. "Done?" she asked. "Mostly." He leaned back in the chair. The lobby was quiet. A man in a coat was looking at his phone by the door. "Water sounds from somewhere. It wasn't what I thought it would feel like. What did you think?" "I thought it would feel like something ending." He looked at the ceiling. "It just feels like information, something I've absorbed." "That might be what endings feel like," Renata said, "when they've been happening a long time before you name them." They sat quietly for a moment. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know yet." He thought about the house, which was very quiet in the mornings now. He thought about the French press and the 2 cups he still sometimes poured. Work. Read more. "I've been meaning to read more." Renata smiled, not widely but genuinely. "Ambitious." "I know." He looked at her. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't said something." "I mean that. You would have figured it out eventually," she said. "Maybe, but probably not before she finished." "Why did it matter to you?" She considered this not performing consideration, but actually working through it. "Because I was a person who saw something and looked the other way. And then I was put back in front of it, and this time I was in a position to be useful." She paused. "I think we don't always get to correct the moments we regret. When we do, it seems worth doing." Martin nodded. Outside, the March light was the tentative kind, not warm yet, but suggesting warmth. He stood and buttoned his coat, and Renata stood with him, tucking her book under her arm, and they walked out through the glass doors into the gray, uncertain morning. He drove home alone. The house looked the same from the outside, the same pale paint, the same 2 steps up to the porch, the same window where the light came through unevenly in the afternoon. He sat in the car for a while before going in. Not from grief, exactly, but from the ordinary weight of transition. That specific gravity that comes not from catastrophe, but from clarity, from arriving at the plain, unadorned truth of how much had been spent, and on what and why. 19 years was not nothing. It was not retrievable either. Those two facts coexisted without canceling each other. He went inside. He made coffee in the French press. He poured one cup. He stood at the counter and drank it slowly, watching the light move across the floor, and he thought, this is what a life looks like when you finally stop looking away from it. Not ruined, not restored, just visible, accountable. It was not a dramatic thought, it was not meant to be, but it settled in him with the quiet permanence of something true, and he carried it into the rest of the day.